come to another. We say there are three Tripitaka. There are three baskets. So we discussed two baskets already. That one is the Vinaya, one is the Sutta basket, and then now we come to the Sutra and Abhidhamma, or you could say the basket of Abhidhamma. Okay. Do you want to read? Do you want to read? Do you want to try? Page 45, the Sutra and Abhidhamma, the problem of texture, authenticity. Could you find that?
Yes.
Okay.
The Nikayas, Agamas are a collection of sutras or discourses regarded as delivered by Buddha. The older term for discourse of the Buddha preserved in Pali is Sutta.
Yeah, Sutta.
It is not clear what this term originally meant. What Buddhists start Sanskritizing their text there chose the word sutra. This is the term which literally means threads. Compare English sutra. But in a literary context refers especially to authoritative Brahmanika.
Okay, good.
Okay. Text consisting of a string of
terse, yeah. Aphoristic, yeah.
Verses, which a pupil might memorize and a teacher might take as a basis for exposition. Buddhist sutras, however, are not in this form. As Richard Gombrich has pointed out, it is perhaps more likely that Middle
Aryan
Sutta corresponds to Sanskrit suttas, which
Sukta,
which means something. This is well said, and was early in the history of Indian literature used to refer to the inspired
hymns
of the
Vedic.
That makes up the collection of the
Rig Veda.
Early Buddhists can therefore be seen as claiming as a status on a par with the Vedas for the utterances of the Buddha.
Okay, all right. Any comment? It is difficult because when you learn Buddhism, there are lots of terminology there, and but you will get used to anyway. Yeah. Now, please remember the word sutta in Chinese, jinma, jin. In Sanskrit, it's so sutra. Okay. In Pali, it's sutta. So it depends. Sometimes if you like to write sutta, you want to write sutra. Okay. But nowadays we can translate as discourse, right? Sometimes we translate text. Like Buddhist text means Buddhist sutra or Buddhist discourse. Okay. And then I guess because anyway, that what the sutra means, there's lots of controversial understanding. So, but generally, to Buddhism at least understand usually, or even in Chinese also mean the thread. Because it means like a thread passed down. It can transmit one to another. So that means the sutra. Sutta. Yes.
I've got a question about translation. So when a language gets translated from one to another, is there any uncertainty about the interpretation?
Yeah, a lot.
With the punctuation or how it gets translated?
There are a lot. That's the reason why even when I read translation, I usually don't read translation. I mean, depends. The modern translation is getting better and better because they have the previous experience and saw how people make mistakes and so forth. And also, not only that, because the punctuation, especially the Chinese, have much problem because in Sanskrit and Pali, at least they do have a way to show the punctuation. Even in earlier time, that's their language, because they, for example, they have a comma and full stop. They will have a slash. The slash represent comma, two slash represent the full stop, right? But in Chinese, they don't have the old language. Even now, I mean, those people who participate in my class, like weekend class sometimes for, actually I do my punctuation. Sometimes I also read again, I find my punctuation was wrong again. You know, I could do that always. Because in old days, all the sutra in Chinese, no punctuation at all. Then you could imagine that would be a huge job. Let alone to say whether you understand right or not. Because translation actually is a kind of interpretation too. So, but that's why even just simply look at the Heart Sutra in English, there are so many different translations. Some are really horrible, but to me, it's especially if you look from the Sanskrit, from a Sanskrit perspective, you know, but some really love it. I don't know, and but anyway.
How well are these translated?
I think it's probably quite important because I make notes too. If there's a dispute, he say, you know, there are some people have different opinion on that. So nowadays, that's why I said the modern one is better because they make some notes and tell you that occurs certain problematic. Or also, he also might be sometimes when he translate, he put a term, and then he will say how did he follow that commentary understanding, but maybe some other, the term might not necessarily be such a way to. So there's a discussion. That's why when you look at the translation by Bhikkhu Bodhi, you do find there are lots of notes. There is huge notes around. Okay. Yeah, it's the same thing when that's why we have conference also. Sometimes when we read the Mahayana text, when you compare the Sanskrit and how the Chinese interpret it, and then there are lots of dispute there. Because, for example, one I offer a conference paper was about translation, actually, more like to do translation. Like the Lotus Sutra, 就是那个 Lotus Sutra in Chinese 叫什么？妙法莲华经, for example, mentioned that, you know, there is no one, but there's no one and two, but only the third. That is mean the Mahayana. So, but actually in Sanskrit, not only I said that, even the ancient master Kokui-ji, he also pointed out, when you read the Sanskrit, it's not like that. Because everybody Chinese think that's mean, because in Chinese translation, they don't have di and dia, you know. Actually, it refers in Sanskrit mean there's no first one and second one, but only the third one. So that means the Mahayana one. But that might be, it make a huge difference, because if there's no one or two, but only third, but only the third, the three, so it means the Mahayana is the only one. But here it just only say, if you say there's no first and second, but the third one as the Mahayana, it means they recognize the two exist, but only the Mahayana are the better, you know. Not mean these two is not there, but actually the Buddha only say one, you know. So those are the translation problem too. And well, but actually Chinese didn't translate it wrong, not necessarily, because the Chinese that time when they translate, the word is not clear because they put that in the verse, you know, when in the verses form. So that's one of the, anyway, I don't want to put it too long. So that's one of the things, lots of translation things need to be discussed also, yeah. So I would suggest when you read the book, maybe I would definitely find the scholar translation, usually. But not necessarily because they are correct, but they at least give you a lot of information, how you look at it, you know. All right, no any other questions? So shall we go to the next paragraph? But that is, okay, yeah. Did we start from here or start from here? Okay, okay.
Be that as it may, a Buddhist sutra always begins with the words, "Thus I have heard. At one time the Lord was staying at." The later tradition understands these as the words of Ananda, the Buddha's attendant, introducing each discourse of the Buddha as the first communal recitation. At the first communal recitation. The inclusion of this particular formula at the beginning of a Buddhist text indicates that the text claims the status of the word of the Buddha. Buddha
Vajana.
It is clear that from a very early date there is a tacit understanding that to claim the status for a text, is not only to claim that it represents only what has actually been uttered by the Buddha in person. Even the Nikaya Agama collections accepted as the word of the Buddha by all ancient schools, there are sutras presented as delivered not by the Buddha, but by monks and nuns who were his chief pupils, some of them after his death.
Okay. You want to read the next one?
As indicated above, the notion of a fixed canon of Buddhist scriptures is somewhat problematic, and we must be careful not to impose inappropriate notions of canon and authenticity. To impose derive say from Christianity on the Buddhist tradition. Even in the account of the first Buddhist council were told of a monk who, on hearing of the recitation of the Buddha's teaching by the 500 arhats, declared that he preferred to remember the teaching as he himself had heard it directly from the Buddha. For several centuries, as Buddhism spread across the Indian subcontinent, it is clear that while the Buddhist community accepted and preserved a common core of textual material, this material constituted a canon in only a rather loose and informal sense. That each and every collection of textual material should correspond exactly was not regarded by the early community as the critical issue.
All right, thank you. All right, why don't we just finish the next paragraph first? Now? Do you want to read the next one? Yeah.
This state of affairs is reflected in the discussion of the four great authorities, Mahapadesa, to which a monk might appeal for accepting a particular teaching as authentic Dharma, that he has learned it from the Buddha himself, from a community of elder monks, from a group of learned monks, or from one learned monk. In each case, the Buddha is recorded as having instructed monks to examine and consider the teaching in order to see if it conforms to what they already know the teaching to be. This is not quite as subjective as it sounds. The discourses of the Buddha, as preserved in the Nikayas, do not of themselves constitute a systematic exposition of Buddhist thought with a beginning, middle, and end. Each discourse is rather presented as a more or less self-contained piece on a particular theme, and yet the discourses as a whole do contain quite explicit indications of how these various themes relate to each other and fit together to form an overall structure and pattern. The final criterion for judging a teaching lies in an appreciation and understanding of this overall structure and pattern of the teaching. Thus, at times, the question of who originally spoke the words appear irrelevant to the tradition. Whatever monk, nun, male or female, lay follower, God, or Brahma may teach and proclaim Dharma, it is all considered as taught and proclaimed by the teacher, i.e. the Buddha. Nevertheless, the principle that certain texts represent the primary word of the Buddha, while others are secondary work of commentators and scholars, remains significant to the Buddhist tradition, and the question of just which texts are to be counted as the word of the Buddha has, as at particular points in the history of Buddhism, been a critical one.
Okay. Now we come to the term, I think, anyway, any other question with what we had just read? No? Okay, why don't we just go on next one? The term Abhidhamma.
The term Abhidhamma, Pali Abhidhamma, means approximately higher or further. Dhamma. In many ways, the extant words of the basket of Abhidhamma, the third part of the ancient canon of Buddhist scripture, can be seen as continuing the process of systematization already evident in the Nikayas, that some form of commentary and interpretation form part of Buddhism almost from its inception is indicated by certain of the sutras in the Nikayas. The Mahavidala Sutta, for example, recounts how a nun is approached and asked to comment on certain technical terms of the Buddha's teaching. In the Vinaya, each rule of the monastic discipline is followed by a word analysis.
Analysis, sorry.
Yeah,
analysis, yeah.
Which defines key terms of the rulings, and one of the later book of the Pali Canon must be the Netisa exposition, which takes the form of a commentary of a section of another work of the canon, the Sutta Nipata, group of discourses. But it is the Abhidhamma par excellence that represents the earliest attempt to give a full and systematic statement of the Buddha's teaching on the basics of what is contained in his discourses. The traditional understanding is thus that while the sutras represent the Buddha's teaching, applies in the particular circumstances as the particular time and place, the Abhidhamma is the Buddha's teaching stated in bare and general terms without reference to any particular circumstances.
Okay, thank you. Okay. Anyway, I think there might be some difficulty for some of your guides because they are lots of terms like Mahavedala Sutta and Nidesa. But what actually generally wanted to say is that you could still trace, that's kind of like indirectly saying that the Abhidhamma is a later development, but then you still can trace that, there's a similarity system or the technique or the structure from like in early sutta, for example, the Mahavedala. And also this kind of system, even like commenting, sometimes you do find a little different text like Nidesa. The Nidesa actually is almost like commentary, commenting some of the popular sutra. So, and this certainly came very early also, but you could say that maybe came even earlier than, it been passed out even earlier than the Abhidhamma. But then that kind of trace, you could say, understand that's how the Abhidhamma comes along also. The other important point, well, I guess what is not here is also, I think the Rupert trying to say is, even though the authentic way of saying that, how you prove whether this is taught by the Buddha, the word of the Buddha, is because it's always said, thus have I heard by the Ananda. But we also have to bear in mind, actually, in some way, the Buddhism do not really, how we put it here, do not really always think that the text is always have to be taught by the Buddha, too, as to be regarded as the early text, or so-called the direct word from the Buddha, because there are certain texts in the sutta were taught by the nun, or taught by the chief disciple like Sariputta, Moggallana, and so forth. But then it is very hard to define. Say then that is a word of the Buddha. It's not actually the word of Buddha, right? So the way to understand the word of Buddha have so many. It open up to so many discussion. Okay. All right, and then that's how you have the third Tripitaka called the Abhidhamma Tipitaka, and the one of the unique function of the third Tipitaka, it's the last line is say is the Buddha's particular time. No, is the teaching stated in bare and general terms without reference to any particular circumstance. In other words, the Abhidhamma text is just only list out and also maybe discuss and enumerate the Buddhist teachings. But there's no say, when the Buddha was where and what happening, who came to see him, or something happened. Nothing, those circumstances, nothing mentioned. It just directly to the list. So here is also the Abhidhamma text. Okay. So then But I didn't bring all of them because Abhidhamma definitely is even larger. That's why when you say you are the Tupidaga, mean you are the Sanzang Fa Shi, the most difficult is this one, is the Abhidhamma. The sutra, if you don't read the sutra, it's very hard to study Abhidhamma. Because Abhidhamma is almost like they took all the sutra, the teachings, into a system. Okay. Let me see what it is. Okay. Here they translate as a Buddhist psychology ethic. Okay. Of course, to the West. This is the earlier translation. We don't have the. Actually, we don't have the new translation. This is the. I guess this maybe translate the 1970. No, this is. Yeah, this is maybe early. No, earlier. The first published was 1900. That's why I say the Polytech Society in England. In those who were sponsored by the Royal Academy in England, so they do the translation. So this is the. Anyway, this is about the Abhidhamma. For example, they start. When you say it's a kusala, mean a wholesome mind, what does mean by the wholesome mind? So he say, when a good thought concerning the essential universe has arisen, which is accompanied by gladness associated with knowledge and has da-da-da-da-da-da-da. So it's really hard to study if you don't have, I guess. I remember when I started to study, there's always no way if you just read it by yourself, but definitely you need to learn the system. That's what we call the Abhidhamma, okay? Usually if you claim yourself no Abhidhamma in that country, let me just say, for example, the Abhidhamma will start to eliminate, there were 89 kinds of mind, and then they have 54 kinds of mind association. And then you must remember each kind of mind, what that kind of mind is doing, and how this mind is functioning. And then after when you learn this, then you have to learn how this mind relates to the material, the body, the physical material. And after that, you also have to learn and how the mind go from one mind to another mind and what function of them. So that's why it's complete psychology. Actually, it's one of the, even for, if you study psychology, when they read this thing, they were so surprised that definitely this is much deeper than nowadays you learn psychology. So imagine that you just simply think about when you started to define the mind, have 89 types. And then not only 89 types, you just like define there's one hand. There are 89 of the hands. And then you need to know when this mind arises, there were 54 kind of mind association. So there are 13 of them were always there. And the 7 of them are always definitely will be there. And sometimes they arise 23 type of association, sometimes only 20. Anyway, minimal maybe just 7, or you could say 13, something like that. So you need to know that. But of course you might be saying, why do you do this? Because you know Buddhism actually from practices talk about mind all the time. So for example, how do you explain, even from meditation, that I am now happy? Say that I have a pen and I'm happy. But you know, this first time when you have a pen, you're happy. And the second time, you are also happy. But there's a little different quality in your happiness too. That means something is missing there or something is added there. So what are these? So, and that's why the Abhidhamma, or the Buddhist psychology, you could say, it's not only just psychology, but I want to say then it's one of the topic of the Abhidhamma. And then you started to talk about also the universe, how these mental connect to the whole universe. Because in Buddhism believe that when the moment you are good, and then you connect to the whole universe already. That's why we talk about karma, you know, something like that. Anyway, so you could just go through a little bit. I don't mean you go through, you just know it's also very, this is not all of them, okay? All of them is much more bigger than that. And there was few of the texts, like one of the texts, you need at least to remember all 89 types of mind, 54 kind of mind associations, and then how many type of materials, and then you must know function, how it works, you know, and so forth. And then you start to read the first paragraph, because he'll tell you when you see something, what kind of mind is going on, and what mind associate that, and why associate, why they don't associate, and so forth. Anyway, it's very complicated. I'm not joking. I don't think anybody, if no teacher teach, they can read it. Yes.
So
Okay.
does that mean, like, if they wrote these, does that mean, like, the Buddha at some point in his 49 years of teaching, like, actually talked about all these things and they just summarized them?
Yeah,
It out? It's sort of like
it definitely, it's, I mean, if you look at it compared to the sutra, I traditionally believe that that was also actually taught by the Buddha. I guess we're going to read that later, you say that. But if you look at nowadays, the modern scholarly study, all the topics, it's actually in the sutta. It just be illuminated and systematized.
Someone like wrote a summary, basically.
Okay. That's why I say study Buddhism is very different from study other religion. But however, I want to say this because for people who are not familiar, however, when you really look at the Buddhism as superficially, then you thought that very similar to other religion, but not from the text perspective, okay? Not from the textual perspective. All right. Where we are now?
Second paragraph, page 48.
Thank you. Anyone going to read it? You? Okay.
Something of the Abhidhamma method must go back to the lifetime of the Buddha himself. Certainly, much of its outlook and many of its principles must be regarded as still forming part of the common heritage of Buddhism, alongside the Nikaya Agama Sutta collection and the monastic rule of the Vinaya. Yet, in addition to what is common, we begin to find in the Abhidhamma literature interpretations and understandings of the sutra material that are specific to particular schools of Buddhism. We must be careful, however, to understand this situation in the light of our knowledge of just what constitutes a Buddhist school in ancient India, and to avoid the trap of thinking that Buddhist schools, quotation, evolved and defined themselves in the same way as, say, Christian sects or denominations.
All right, okay. Yeah, anyone, next one? You have a question? Okay, yeah.
We have substantial knowledge of the Abhidhamma literature and systems of only two ancient Buddhist schools. The
Sarvastivadins. Sarvastivadins.
Sarvastivadins and the Theravadins. The only obvious similarity between their respective Abhidhamma Pitaka collections, however, is that they both contain just 7 works, see chapter 7. Despite the great status and authority attributed to the Abhidhamma and the claim that it is the word of the Buddha, both these schools explicitly acknowledge the work of Buddha's chief disciples in arranging and transmitting the Abhidhamma. From this point of view, the Abhidhamma has for the tradition the status of a sutra or set of headings expanded by one of the Buddha's disciples, and then subsequently endorsed by the Buddha. Even so, some ancient Buddhists, such as
Sautrantikas,
or those who follow the sutra, came to resist the notion that the Abhidhamma had the full status of the word of the Buddha. Yet, while such a group may have wished to deny the Abhidhamma the status of the Buddha's word, it is clear that they did not seek to question the method and principle of Abhidhamma in their entirety. What they were concerned to question were particular interpretation and understanding current amongst certain exponents of the Abhidhamma.
All right, the last one. You want to read that? Yeah.
To sum up, a typical ancient Indian canon of Buddhist texts consisted of 3 baskets: Chipitaka, the Sutra Pitaka, or baskets of discourses comprising 4 main collections of discourses of the Buddha, often with supplementary collection of miscellaneous texts. The Vinaya Pitaka, or basket of monastic discipline, and the Abhidharma Pitaka, or basket of further Dharma. Only one such ancient Tripitaka survives complete in an ancient Indian language, the Pali canon of the Theravadan tradition of Sri Lanka and Southeast Asia. How many other recensions of this ancient Tripitaka existed is unclear, but the contents and arrangement of others may be partially reconstructed on the basis of the surviving fragments in Indian languages and Chinese and Tibetan translations. In this respect, we have the fullest knowledge of the canon of the Sarvastivadins.
All right, thank you. This is difficult chapter anyway, especially when you are haven't read any of that. It's really open up lots of imagination. What else I need to say? Anyway, maybe best to say any question. I guess. Are we? Yeah.
What is Abhidhamma in Chinese?
Abhidhamma. Abhidhamma. And I will write the Chinese because that's why usually one of the big question we ask whether the people really know, even though they don't understand what the subject is. If you want to know whether that person have the basic knowledge of Buddhism, just ask what is Abhidhamma. If they cannot answer you know that person actually don't have the foundation of, don't have a basic knowledge of Buddhism. Because this is very easy. When people say, oh, I read a lot of sutra, then you say, then tell me, 什么是 Abhidhamma? That depends how I answer you. Then you know whether he really have a well-rounded understanding. I will write that first. Abhi. It's Abhidhamma. Actually, that's how they write it. Okay. No, I didn't. But then there's another translation I'm going to write. Yeah, this pen is going to. Oh, because of water. 有水是吧？哦，那等一下。不能等一下，这是湿的吗？
是干的，现在不行。
Maybe. And sometimes we do 那个拿到另外一支笔给我好了，可能。那个那些不行。哦，那不行。Okay. No, right, wrong. To the shorten. No, I write it wrong. I forgot how to write already. 笔谈。云啊，对对对。So, or sometimes the shortened form is 笔谈, but for the Shenzhuan translation, usually they just say 对法藏. Okay. 对法藏. Okay. That's mean Abhidhamma in Chinese. But usually the Chinese prefer to translate based on the Shenzhuan's translation, it's called 对法, mean confronting to the Dhamma, or just face to face to the Dhamma. Okay. And then, but the 笔谈 is just because Chinese doesn't like a long term, Abhidhamma, right? That's why they usually just for the sake of speaking, sometimes we just say 笔谈, 笔谈. Okay. Okay. That's mean the Abhidhamma. Okay. So usually, we understand when we say there's a Tripitaka, it means that there was three Tripitaka. I mean, one is the basket. It's called the Abhidhamma basket. Okay. Any other question? Actually, I thought maybe people have lots of questions. Yes.
So does that mean that like the sutra actually includes everything in all Tripitaka, but like the discipline and the Abhidhamma just like pulled out certain parts and summarize them separately?
Yeah, I mean that's how that's how the Pali canon understand that way. Okay. Yeah. And
well, I guess the question of, as earlier I mentioned the Chinese Tripitaka, and so that's just a similar set, but translated at different times along the same categories. actually talking about the third Bible.
That's what he say. You know, if you want to think about if there's a full set of it, so far, I mean, look at the present history. It's just only we have a party. But if you look at in India in those days, definitely you also have Tripitaka from different. He mentioned the school, right? There were different school. Different school they have a different Tripitaka. But I guess for now the modern research, because we do have certain Tripitaka. For example, the sutra. We just mentioned the Sutra Pitaka we have in Chinese. But actually the Chinese one, it's also from different school. So, for example, the Middle Land Discourse, it's from Sarasvati school. That's what we just read, the difficult term. And then the Ekutara, that means the numerical one with the number one, numerical discourse, actually the research thing is belong to the Mahasangika school. It's different school. The Chinese used to have the full set of the Tripitaka also. I mean, like Agama, say Sutra basket, but somehow lost many. So that's why nowadays when you look at Agama, they are not belong to one school. There are few school. You know, some this was belong to other school, that belong to other school. Okay. So, but then the confusing thing about and also the Chinese have many Vinaya Pitaka. They have collection because China in those days, even they send off the envoy out the monks to collect the different version of the Vinaya, the monastic code. So that's why the Chinese have the Vinaya of different school also. That's why when you do a research of Vinaya, it's very important to learn Chinese because they have different school. Then you do a lot of comparative study. But then the Abhidhamma also, here I mentioned, but if you look at so far now the Abhidhamma have a better collection, maybe definitely is even Chinese, not even in Tibetan. But then the Chinese have the Abhidhamma, but they don't have the full thing, as we say. They may have, luckily with almost, not all, but almost, we have the full 7, because the Abhidhamma has 7 volumes. So they have the 7 volumes of Abhidhamma as well. But the Chinese, as I say, Chinese never identify themselves belong to what school, right? So they have one of the, that's also because of Zhenzhuang Fashi. Actually, he went to India to come back. One of the reasons is because he wanted to have a whole set of this system, that is Sarasvati. So Zhenzhuang Fashi, when he found that there were some of the Abhidhamma were not translated, or translate not, he was not very happy about the translation, he retranslated this Abhidhamma text. Okay. So then, luckily now we have the full, almost full, not all, the 7 volumes of the origin of Abhidhamma text from one school called Sarasvati.